Puures pahtin tämän Saami Assai NAISA North Raitus. Welcome to the Sápmi part of the NAISA North panel series. Mulla on Jounajon Anne Kirsti Rauna ja mislät ne kolmo Assalasti muun Áslat ja Oula-Antti. Kät muisteleva vähän äänet Eitsaskapirra. Millä puokkaa meiltä Siidaskuvlas. Ja kiitän NAISA North ja Decinta Poutehusas ja tämän vähän paneella raittu läidämis. I'm Rauna Kuokkanen and I'd like to thank NAISA North and Decinta for the invitation to join and for organizing this series. Today we are three presenters, myself and Áslat Holmberg and Oula-Antti Labba. They will say a few words about themselves in the beginning of their presentations. And we are all part of the Siidaskuvla, which is a collaborative community-driven renewal of Sami Siida system by Sami scholars, artists and activists to explore how and which Siida practices could operate as part of Sami governance structures today. And Siida is a traditional Sami social political organization that was in operation for hundreds of years until other colonial structures were imposed upon it or on top of it. It has never been cancelled, but it's no longer in operation in a larger scale. It is functioning to a degree within reindeer herding and the called Sami political organization. The Siidaskuvla aims at decolonizing Sami society through reclaiming and re-engaging with the traditional Sami Siida system and its concomitant laws and practices. Our objective has been to generate novel interdisciplinary artistic, political and cultural knowledge about the traditional Sami governance structures, practices and values, and the ways in which they can be practiced in contemporary settings. The project is called Siidaskuvla in recognition of the fact that considering the ongoing colonization, our individual knowledge of the Siida system is limited. None of us know a whole lot. There are some who know more, but in a sense, we are all learners and teachers to one another and learning from one another. In addition, the engagement of participation of children and youth and also the older generation has been central to the project. And we have been producing scholarly, artistic and performative knowledge, podcast series. We are editing a handbook in the Sami language. A children's book is coming out very soon, also in the Sami language, and a special journal issue in the world's only Sami language academic journal, Sami Tietäläisäikitsaala. And also we have a web archive of all these materials that we are producing. And this panel today draws on this special journal issue, the Siidaskuvla special journal issue, some of the Siidaskuvla members are contributing to. Initially, we were going to be 5 members or 5 people in this panel today, but due to very busy schedules this time of the year, 2 unfortunately weren't able to join us. Each of us represent for about 15 minutes based on the articles in this special journal issue, which we all written in the Sami, but obviously we'll be presenting in English. And at the end, we'll see if there are any questions or comments to one another, so we can have a brief conversation. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to our first speaker, Áslat Holmberg. So please, you can start by briefly introducing yourself.
Joo, kiitos Rauna. Ja puhutaan päivä muuja päällessä mulla on Skuvla olema Ásla ja Jonas Aila NAISA Áslat tai Áslat Holmberg puhutaan Njörkkänis tienuliais ja kiihtu poutehtusas serva tämän paneelin. So my name is Áslat Holmberg and I come from the village of Njörkkän, which is North Sami area. I live next to the big river Detno. and I will be sharing about Sami knowledge on the river and salmon. Yes, so this is sort of a summary of my master's thesis and a bit extended scope. While in my master's thesis, I looked into the Sami way of knowing about the river and the salmon, and the biologists' way of knowing, and compared those two knowledge systems. Then in this article, I also take a step further and consider what kind of management actions could be considered based on the Sami knowledge in today's situation. So I'll be speaking a bit briefly, some general information about the river Tietnu and salmon there, and then I'll be speaking about Sami indigenous knowledge and biological studies on the river and salmon. Yeah, weather. I got my coffee delivered. I am so lucky. Oh, look. Yes, then I'll briefly compare the two knowledge systems, what is similar and perhaps what is challenge in when those two knowledge systems try to communicate. And in the end, I propose some management actions based on Sami knowledge. So I put the text changes the new normal there, because that is really the case. We don't have any normal summers anymore. Yeah, just briefly, as I mentioned, I'm from Tietnu River Valley. I grew up fishing salmon. This is a summary of my master's thesis that I wrote in indigenous studies in University of Tromsø on the Norwegian side of Sápmi. I am currently vice president of the Sami Council and work with Arctic and environment issues as well as research ethics. So Tietnu is in Sami, it can be translated to Great River, and it is more than 16,000 square kilometers wide, the whole watershed, or for those who don't speak in kilometers, it's 6,300 square miles, the area of the watershed. So it's quite big in our standards. It's also the most diverse Atlantic salmon river in the world, with more than 30 genetically distinct salmon populations. And the people who live in the river valley often refer to ourselves as Chatsekätte Olomot, which means the people of the shore, or yeah, people who live next to the water. And yeah, salmon is essential part of our way of life, and it's basically the reason why we have inhabited the area in the first place. Well, if I'm to describe the situation in Tietnu briefly, I would say that we are living in times of crisis. First, in 2017, there were strong restrictions on salmon fishing, which targeted mainly the Sami traditional fishing. But after that, especially in the past 3 years, there has been a strong decline in the salmon stocks. And as a result, then in 2021, it was the first time in history that there was a complete ban on salmon fishing in this river. At the same time, there was a invasion of this new species, or it's new in such great numbers. We have had pink salmon also previously, but this time it for the first time outnumbered the native Atlantic salmon. So there were about 4 times more pink salmon than there was Atlantic salmon. So we're facing a decline in the native species and almost a skyrocketing amount of pink salmon has been coming. So quite a dramatic change in the ecosystem. And now it seems like for this summer there will be also a ban on salmon fishing. As I mentioned, we don't have really normal summers. There can be a flood throughout the summer. Some summers we've had very low water levels and high water temperatures. So a few words on Sami knowledge. Well, first of all, Sami used to govern the fishing in River Dietno in the upper parts of the stream until the 19th century. And in the 17th century, it was still Sami only had the right to fish in the river. And of course, fishing was governed through indigenous knowledge, and it was done by Siida, which, as Rauna mentioned in the beginning, is or was the traditional Sami governance structure, a village. And they organized the collective fishing methods in the Siida structure and also solved possible disputes on the fishing places and so on. These collective fishing methods had very effective forms of fishing. There was like a cross river weir, and it had to be closely communicated on when to let salmon go through the weir, so that there will be enough salmon in the tributaries as well. Sami knowledge holders recognize many threats to the salmon, such as increased erosion, increased predation, as well as a large number of tourist fishing. Also, climate change is recognized as a threat, and the decline of the species that salmon feeds on in the ocean, as well as salmon farming and the lice and disease, as well as the genetic change that can bring to the salmon. So it used to be done that the predators of salmon and the salmon juveniles were restricted strongly. So, for example, there was a lot of hunting of birds such as gooseanders and cormorants, seals and otters that also feed on salmon were hunted much more than they are nowadays, and predatory fish like pike, sea trout, burbot were also fished, as well as grayling and whitefish, who eat the roes of the salmon. So there were strong actions in place to limit the number of predators and thus increase the juvenile production of salmon. So the biologists who study Dietno, there has been quite a long dispute between the Sami knowledge holders and the biologists on what are the main reasons of decline, or even is there such a strong decline as it's claimed in the salmon stocks. Although now in the recent years it has become quite evident that the number of salmon has strongly decreased, but there wasn't a consensus on that some time back. And it's up until the recent years that the biologists were concluding that overfishing is basically the only significant driver of decline in the salmon stocks. And just in the past few years, they have also changed their interpretation of the situation, because such a fast decline in the salmon stocks that we have experienced, it cannot be explained with overfishing, because the juvenile production in the river doesn't correlate with the small number of salmon returning to the river. So something is happening to the smolts, the small salmon that are leaving Diatno to go to the ocean, and then they are not returning. So there are no clear explanations to what is causing this, but one likely reason is that the food of salmon, the capelin small fish, it has migrated a couple of 1,000 kilometers north due to warming waters, and when salmon go to their traditional feeding territories, then they don't find any food there, and then they don't grow and return as big salmon. Yes, so there is the what I call the Tana research group. It has 2 members from Finland and 2 from Norway. They are fish biologists, and they write the official reports on the status of the salmon stocks in the Diatno watershed. They are mandated to consider Sami knowledge in their reports, but there are some obstacles or some room for criticism, as I see it. So one thing is that Sami knowledge needs to be proved in order to be considered relevant to the studies. So they aim to consider the Sami knowledge and prove it with their methods that they have. And if they cannot prove the Sami knowledge to be correct, then they conclude that it is untrue, because we cannot, in our methods, we cannot prove it to be true. But what is challenge there is that their methods are based on calculating estimates, and that requires data or knowledge that can be transformed into a numerical form. And not all Sami knowledge can be presented in numerical form, such as the behavior of salmon, or that salmon needs to have peace at the time of spawning. It can be quite challenging to quantify all types of Sami knowledge, and then it's if you cannot quantify it, then you cannot calculate estimates, and they don't really have efficient methods for evaluating qualitative knowledge. So a lot of that is simply left out of consideration. Some Sami knowledge could be quantified, but it's not, such as knowledge on the amount of spawning grounds or redds that has diminished or been lost due to erosion. There is a lot of areas that used to have gravel in the bottom of the river, but it has been covered by sand or mud nowadays, which means that there is less space for salmon to spawn. Also, the impact of predators could be quantified, and just in last summer there was the first study released that actually tries to do this to an extent, and they do conclude that the predation is a significant force impacting negatively the salmon juvenile survival, and also then the salmon production potential of the river. So what happens when they try to estimate each of the issues that the Sami knowledge holders raise? They try to address them one by one, and when they cannot prove that this specific issue would be strong enough force to cause a decline in the salmon stock, and after evaluating each of the issues that the knowledge holders raise, or many of them, they conclude that none of these issues individually can be the cause of decline of salmon stocks. But what is missing is more of a holistic evaluation of the impacts, because it's not the claim that only one issue is the cause of decline, but the cumulative impact of all the changes that have happened in the salmon's environment, and that impacted through its different stages of its life cycle, that the cumulative impacts are causing the decline in the salmon stocks. But this is not holistically evaluated in the biological studies. Yeah, I think this is my final slide. So what could be considered to be done in this situation based on Sami knowledge? Well, everything currently points towards the ocean, that is where the biggest problem or biggest changes have happened, and in the ocean survival. So what should be considered is looking into the status of the salmon as food species, which also are fished to feed the salmon that are in the salmon farms, and some of these stocks have strongly declined, or, as was mentioned, migrated northwards. So it should be considered if fishing of these species could be moderated so that there would be more food for salmon. Also regulating the salmon farming and mitigating the negative impacts of open net farms should be done. Actions to strengthen the juvenile production of salmon, such as decreasing the number of predators by fishing the predatory fish, or hunting the species that feed on salmon, as well as restoring the spawning redds that have been lost, and slowing down erosion, as has been done before by strengthening the river banks with rocks and so on. Also regulating the fishing pressure should be done, and shifting the fishing pressure to other species. So Atlantic salmon is not the only species that we have. Of course, now we have the invasive pink salmon, which is a very good fish when it arrives to the river, but it has to be caught immediately before it starts to reach its spawning state, and it changes the taste of the fish. Also, we have plenty of sea trout, grayling pike, which could be fished more instead of salmon. Also, stronger regulation of tourist fishing, both the times and catches wise, could be done. There should be periods when salmon do have peace in the river, so that there are not fishers all the time in the river, disturbing the salmon, especially at the time of spawning. And also releasing the big salmon should be considered. Of course, those that are caught alive, because there is a decline in the number of big salmon that also produce a lot of juveniles and ensure the continuation of the big salmon in the river. Yes, that was what I wanted to share with you. So kiitos, thank you.
Ollu kiitos Áslat, niin hui miellä kiittäväs ja äikeköitelis saakkavuorosta. Täällä maittai hui äikekouteli olmui mielas täällä. So thank you Áslat for very interesting and very timely presentation. It's something that is currently being very actively discussed and debated along the river as the fishing season now closed would be approaching. Thank you. The next speaker is Oula-Antti Labba, and he will be also presenting on Siidas. And I will, well, why don't you, Oula-Antti, introduce yourself first, and then I'll put the map up. So, lei puere, Oula-Antti.
Joo, Olu kiihtuu. Puore Päivi Kuokkanen, mun ammalla Oula-Antti Labba ja mulla Nierre Henorakas ja mun parkka juristan ja tuon mun muistelan tantilalas vuoros muu artikkala pirra mas mun tutkan saalalas kaltui ja meitä muisteli turnosa saami siitä pirra. So, hello everyone. My name is Oula-Antti Labba. I come from Enotekijä, from the Finnish part of Samiland, and I work as a lawyer. At the moment, I'm working in the Sami Council, and I have previously also worked in Sami Parliament in Finland and Minority Rights Group International. And I have been involved in the Siidaskuvla project since the beginning of the project, and I'm now telling you briefly about my article that I have done on this project. So the objective of my article, Sami villages and villagers of Turnosa Sápmi in written sources, was to research what written sources tell about the juridical status of the Siidas, or I'm now translating Siidas in English as Sami villages, and the status of the Siidas, especially as collectives and of the members of the Siidas. And my research method was legal history, and my research question was what was the legal status of Siida and Siida members in different eras. How has it changed and why? And I also studied if the Siidas had this kind of inner jurisdiction. And no joo, tuon sahtari heisottais taltan talla just porre aikitan kartta pokti houta. So Rauna is now showing you a map, and the geographical, I can just briefly explain about the map. So in this map you can see the Siidas, the Sami villages and their borders, and the geographical area where what I studied in my article was the Turnosa Sápmi and it consisted the Siidas Tikkevaari, Sikkevaari, Raunala, Souttivaari, Kuokakeino, Aujovaari, Lahpojauri, and from till mid 17th century Peltojauri, and also Teenusiita and Ohtsejohka. And I can just roughly say that this is it's kind of the same area which is nowadays in the borders of municipality of Kiruna in Swedish side, and in the borders of municipalities of Enontekiö and Utsjoki in the Finnish side, and partly in I think municipalities called Kautokeino, Karasjok, and Tana in the Norwegian side. And actually it was the area was first divided in the middle of 18th century when there became the border between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And the written sources, what I studied, were I can say that the oldest ones were from the 16th century, and that is of course the era when we find written sources, historical written sources, and for example, first taxation records of Swedish, the Kingdom of Sweden, were published on the middle of the 16th century, and these written sources, for example, consist taxation records and court books, but of course then especially the modern era sources are mostly studies and research, especially legal historical researches that have been made on the Siidas. And from the year 1809 till today, the research focuses on those Siidas and the areas that were divided by the borders of the nation states, and the parts that after that became under the governance of Russian Finland and then Finland, and these are the areas of Enontekiö and Utsjoki, which were part of the old Turnosa Sami or Tornio Sami land. And I can just briefly tell about what is Siida and what are the Sami villages. And Siida is a very old land and water using unit, and the origin of the Siida unit system is not known. It's specifically Sami unit, and it has not borne under the influence of Nordic states, according to the studies. And the family-based areas or lands formed an economical body or annual fishing, hunting, and reindeer herding economy for the annual cycle. And Siidas had borders between each other, and Siida members had so-called tax lands inside Siidas. And as you see from this map that there are there are both borders between Siidas, but there used to also be a border between Siidas and agricultural communities. So agricultural communities or farmers lived above of these, or I mean below the Siida or the Sapmi, and the border was called Sami-Rajji or Sami border. And I'm not sure if you can see me or if you can see the map. I'm just ensuring, Rauna, that can you see me on the record?
Yes, you are in a small. Do you want to have the map taken down, or?
Well, the map can be on.
I can see you both.
Okay.
So you are on a smaller screen.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just ensuring because I can only see you and the map. Okay. So the first, as I already told earlier, the first taxation documents that tell about Siidas appear in the 16th century. And I can say that before the first settlement placard of the year 1673, the areas of Siidas were probably almost exclusively inhabited by the Samis. But official marked the Siida members to the text and other official records with the term Lap. And in these particular documents, the term Lap did not mean ethnicity, but it meant the livelihood that the person practiced, and the livelihoods that were called in these documents, so-called Lap livelihoods, were reindeer herding, hunting, and fishing. And it was before the placard, it was only allowed to practice these aforementioned livelihoods inside the Siidas. But after the first settlement placard by the Kingdom of Sweden in 17th century, more and more settlers invaded the lands of Siida, and it was kind of a Kingdom of Sweden, I would say, colonialistic strategy to urge Finns and Swedes to move to Sapmi and inside the Siida areas, and they were the Kingdom of Sweden, for example, offered, for these persons who moved to inside the Siida areas, they were promised 50 years of tax exemptions and exemption from the military. And also in the 17th century, there were also established mines in the Sapmi area, for example, NAISA mountain, and so the Kingdom of Sweden wanted to have persons working there. But about the legal status of the Siidas, the legal history research shows that the members of the Siidas owned their tax lands, and that Siidas had a collective responsibility to pay taxes to the kingdoms on the lands of the Siidas. And in the 17th and 18th century, the local jurisdiction was in the hands of district courts, and the jury consisted of the members of Siida. And this was an important issue because it meant that the Sami sense of justice was taken into account in court. And there are also court cases that prove that customary law was recognized in the jurisdiction. However, there's no clear written evidence that if Siidas had their own customary jurisdiction system in at least in the western part of the Tornus Sami land, but however, in our eastern part of the Sapmi, especially in the Skolt Sami communities, an own customary jurisdiction has existed. And nation state, or I would say kingdom borders, came to Sapmi in the 18th century, as I mentioned, between the border between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in 1751, and this also led to a border agreement which included the protocol Labba that recognized the rights of the Sami people to move across the state borders with their reindeers. And the Kingdom of Sweden recognized, at least until the middle of the 18th century, that the members of the Siidas owned their tax lands, and the right was the same as farmers' right to their land property. And this is, for example, proved in the doctoral thesis by Kaisa Korpiakko and Juhan Päiviö. And studies also show that the state does not, nation state do not have a so-called legal title to the lands and waters of the Siida communities, although they currently administer major part of them. The ancient Siidas disappeared from the official documents in Finland at the latest when Finland became part of Russia in the 19th century. Even if the Siida members paid taxes on Siida lands until the 1920s, the tax that they paid was defined as land tax, which was paid on land property. In some parts of the Sami region, in the current Sami region in Finland, the Siida members became, the recent Sami region or the eastern part of the Tornus Sami region, the Siida members became kind of farm owners, at least in the official documents in the 19th century, because this was a way to protect the ancient and immemorial family tax lands, and so that they did not fall into the hands of the state. And subsequent border closures in 19th century between Finland and still under Russian control at the time, and Norway, and then Sweden, had a profound impact on reindeer herding Sami. Many of them were forced to move from their traditional lands to new places. And there are many reasons why the ancient Siidas disappeared on at least from the official documents and even on daily life. The main reason were the division of the Siidas by the nation-state borders, changes in the reindeer herding, and the transfer of decision-making power on land issues from the local district courts to the state administration. And I can just briefly say that it was an interesting research work, but also very challenging. I had to read and analyze texts that were written in Old Swedish language, and even if they were transcribed into a modern spelling. And it was also hard work to translate them into Northern Sami and find right terminology. And I can also mention that I also wrote a shorter article that focused on how the juridical status of the Siidas as collectives and the members of the Siidas is recognized in the special laws and preliminary works of laws in the era of independence of Finland. But I think that was everything I could tell briefly about this very broad topic. So thank you very much.
Kiitos Oula-Antti. Hui mielenkiintois autan puktimis tänä alo mielenkiintois kullat tämän historia. Thank you Oula-Antti for a very important and interesting talk. It's so important to have the two of your articles in this special issue that we are editing as part of the Siida school, because although, as you mentioned, there is existing research to an extent on the Siida, the legal historical scholarship in particular, but very little in the Sami language. So like scholarship in the Sami language. So it's so important to have the two articles by you coming out now in the Sami language. Thank you. So I then turn to my presentation and will share my screen again. My slide is this one. And this, well, I already introduced myself. Jouna Anne-Kirsti Rauna. Mulla on maite annokatti seeretten mua Áslat. Mulla on patjetiennukoulus kärjesjärkka lahkaferran joas. Ja täällä parkkan Lappi-universiteetas Rovanjärkas maangimusvihtaja ja outoltaan leiden huikuhka parken Kanadas maangimuksen Toronto-universiteetas. So I just quickly introducing myself again. Jouna Anne-Kirsti Rauna Kuokkanen. I'm also from the River Tätnu, like Áslat, so from the upstream from him. And currently I live in Rovaniemi, where I work at the University of Lapland for the past 5 years. And before that, I used to live and work in Canada, most recently at the University of Toronto. And I will be presenting our article in this special issue that I'm trying to get rid of this banner here, but obviously it's not going anywhere, so I have to stick it here. This is an article that we have co-authored. I have co-authored with Asta Paltö, also a member of our Siida school, and it talks about what we have conceived as a Sami concept of relationality. And I will introduce the 4 different practices briefly that we consider in our article. And as we all know, the principle of relationality is the bedrock of indigenous worldviews. And it is also the a foundational concept of indigenous research and shapes, for example, indigenous research methodologies. In our article, we propose that the Sami term "oftastallan" and its practices related to it correspond to the indigenous principle of relationality. And as I mentioned, we consider 4 common practices of oftastallan and examine how Oftastallan can serve as a contemporary means and method of resolving some pressing social and political challenges in today's Sami society. We also consider the ways in which Oftastallan practices can function as a traditional Sami methods of conflict resolution or reconciliation, methods that are frequently used but whose significance we may not always recognize or acknowledge. The questions that we ask in our article is that how is Oftastallan a Sami way of reconciliation, resolving disputes, and also a way of acquiring new understanding into a vexing problem, a way of creating new knowledge, and in this way, how it can contribute to advancing Sami society and well-being today. And also that why it's important to highlight the significance of Oftastallan practices and their role in contemporary Sami society. The 4 Oftastallan practices we consider in our paper include Tervahallan, Kuokkanen, Toulastallan, and Kährestallan. These are fairly straightforward Sami practices, but are hard to translate into English. We have chosen these because they are very common and carry considerable cultural significance in Sami society still today. In addition to the practical activity itself, these practices often consist of spiritual dimensions that remain frequently invisible to those who are not familiar with the practices or history behind them. So in addition to the practical skills, intergenerational knowledge of interdependence with the land is being transferred through these Oftastallan practices. So the first one is Tervahallan. So in simple terms, Tervahallan can be translated as greeting. So it denotes the act of greeting, but comprises several dimensions and meanings. It highlights our belonging to people and places, as well as allows us to get to know other people. According to the Sami practice of greeting, we shake hands and say puures. The verb tervahit derives from the word tirvas, meaning health, and to greet by saying puures, we are wishing health and well-being to the other person. And when Sami meet for the first time, we also commonly ask where the other person is from. We ask whose son or daughter the other person is, and in that way we find out which family or our new acquaintance belongs to, and whether the person is related to us. In short, Tervahallan activates kinship, which is the second Oftastallan practice we consider. So Kuokkanen is a practice where we together, with somebody else, explore, or in a group even, explore and consider our kinship ties to Sami families, and whether we can find a bind, usually a common relative, that connects the two people together. Sometimes we have to rely on the knowledge of elders or genealogical books. If we don't find a common relative, Sami often consider other ties through marriage, work networks, or common acquaintances. So there's this desire to find how yourself and the other person are connected. This kinship knowledge strengthens the sense of belonging to Sami and within the Sami people. Non-Sami people sometimes joke about the expansive concept of Sami kinship, which according to them, 18th cousins are still considered close relatives. Creating places is also a way of connecting with those places. When we travel through a place, a Sami may yoik the place, or greet and talk to the place by saying the name of the place aloud and other places around it. It is also common to connect to a certain place by telling stories about that place or people living in that place. And yoiking, which is the Sami way of it's not singing, kind of like musical expression. Yoiking is another way of greeting other people and places. Someone who knows the other person's yoik and yoiks it upon meeting them is respected and well received. Yoiks also reveal kinship relations beyond the individual. It sort of like places the individual in this network of relations. And actually these are in the wrong order. I will talk about the kaafestallan, which is, my apologies, I don't know what this is doing now. There we go. Kaafestallan, or simply drinking coffee, it's another common practice. Most Sami are very familiar with the expression "paade kaafestallat" or "volkottal kaafestallat." In other words, let's go and have some coffee. When someone comes to visit, they are always at least given a cup of coffee. It is considered a basic responsibility, and children learn from an early age on that visitors are always offered coffee, and that they need to make it if adults happen not to be in the house. In other words, it's something that it's the basic custom that coffee is always offered, if nothing else, to a person who drops in. Importantly, however, kaafestallan is not only about drinking coffee, but the main function is the social interaction. It is a tradition that loosens one's conversation skills. It has also been used as a research method in Sami research. So kaafestallan advances social relations. Traditionally, it has been a means that enables people in small communities to visit, share information, and check on each other's well-being, that everything is all right with them. Even though this may no longer be so common, this kind of dropping in for a cup of coffee without pre-arranging something, given that it not being so common because of the demographic changes and migration to urban areas, kaafestallan has not lost its power and meaning. It is an important part of working life and meetings. Coffee breaks are informal arenas where we often spend longer periods of time in contemplating together or debating a timely issue or pressing challenge, and which may result in new knowledge and awareness. At the same time, we must keep in mind that we cannot idealize kaafestallan practices or say that there are only obviously many people around the world drink coffee, and this is a common practice in most places in the world. So that is not only a Sami practice, but it has certain cultural significance as well, besides being a very common daily occurrence. But that we want also emphasize that it cannot be idealized, also because it can be used in meetings or workplace as a way of excluding also certain individuals from the conversations. And it can create power relations or reinforce existing ones, such as old boys networks. Sami frequently kaafestallat in the woods by the fire. Toolastallan, which is in this list, you can see the third one, or making and sitting by the fire is one of the Ouftastallan practices also we've considered. Often toolastallan and kaafestallan go hand in hand in that nearly always when Sami lights a fire in the woods or up in the mountains, or in the Labba, which you can see in the picture, they also make a pot of coffee. One toolastallan custom is to pour a little coffee either from the pot or one's own cup to the fireplace before drinking it yourself. Some Sami know that they are pouring coffee to Sarahka, the Sami female spirit of the Labba, Labba being the Sami teepee you see in this picture, who lives under the fireplace. Others do this pouring coffee without knowing why they are doing it or for what purpose. It just has become a custom that they have learned. Sarahka has the power to create. Her name literally means the woman who creates and brings life to existence. She protects the Labba and pregnant women and also assists at childbirth. Sharing coffee with her is a way of thanking her and give respect to her skills and gifts. So then I'm going to talk briefly about how Ouftastallan can be considered as a Sami dispute resolution mechanism. A central aspect of indigenous worldviews is seeking balance, which takes place in countless ways. We seek balance with our environments through gifts and reciprocity, but also traditional practices of reconciliation. We commonly conciliate it with people, also other than humans, like non-human beings, as well as with the land and the spirit world. One way of conciliation with our environment is to ask the land a permission to stop or overnight at the specific site. We also may negotiate with the spirits of the land, particularly when we are in need of protection or want to express our gratitude. The permission can also be asked silently, like if you're asking a permission to stay overnight, put up our Labba, for example, can be asked silently, and it involves the obligation to keep the place tidy. According to some Sami scholars, asking permission from the land is a traditional Sami governance practice that often remains invisible to the non-Sami. As an example of a reconciliation practice, Sami legal scholar Ante Sombi mentions her mother as someone whom people used to rely on when there was a disagreement in the family. His mother, the oldest in the large family, starts by visiting the disagreeing parties individually. Afterwards, she calls them, but rarely mentions the disagreement. Instead, she indirectly discusses the other party and their positive qualities and mentions the importance of reconciling. There are no winners or losers in her method, but rather she establishes a space for goodwill that enables and paves way for finding a common path forward. Her method of indirect communication is a very common practice that has been used in other contexts as well, such as the Alta River conflict in the late 70s and early 80s, considered a watershed in Sami-Nordic relations and the Sami policy in Norway. And I won't go into the details of the conflict itself, but sort of look at the Oula-Antti principles in that context. So internally, the issue of hydroelectric construction in the Alta River divided many Sami families, when some adamantly opposed and joined the protests at the construction site, while others approved the government of Norway's decision to construct this dam. Particularly the older generation was concerned that the younger Sami activists were ruining their future in the barricades. For the activists, getting arrested was seen as an honor, while the grandparents were often horrified and ashamed for quote-unquote breaking the law. Another example that has also divided Sami families is homosexuality. The Christian relatives opposing homosexuality may have attempted to talk somebody out of it and seen it as a sickness. And as our examples demonstrate, Kaafestallan in particular has been a common method of finding a path forward, both in the Alta case, Alta River conflict, and this vexing question of homosexuality. It has allowed and enabled finding a compromise, like this sort of using a similar method that Ante Sombi talks about, like spending time with the disagreeing parties and talking about the issue, sometimes not directly, but indirectly, and finding a compromise within the family that allows them to move forward, even though they may not agree on each other's views and positions. So these and other examples demonstrate how traditional practices that on the surface appear very mundane may advance learning and reconciliation and create new understanding and knowledge. Oula-Antti does not always mean a safe or comfortable space, but it does require basic respect for one another and desire to maintain balance in social relations. Sami Oula-Antti practices offer a way of raising and discussing issues where there's a disagreement, but where we can find, through the process of deliberation and behaving, the Sami term olmosvuotta, we can find a common space, or at least an understanding that enables everyone not necessarily to come together, but move forward when not everything can be agreed upon. At the same time, we need to obviously acknowledge that not everything can or need to be reconciled. For example, one's sexuality is not a matter of reconciliation. What we do suggest, however, in our article that through off-the-Stalan practices, we may expand our collective and individual understanding and learn from one another, fears, attitudes, views, biases, and so on, so that oppression and exclusion at least diminishes and acceptance gains more ground. For more than 100 years, the Sami have been active in organizing. Today we have the established political institutions of the Sami parliaments, the Sami council, and countless bigger and smaller Sami organizations and associations. There's a joke that we Sami have an association in every cape of the river. The Sami organizing has been a positive force in many ways, yet at the same time we are still struggling with some of the basic problems and the same problems as the first Sami organizations 100 years ago, and it has to do in particular what Oula-Antti was talking about, the land rights, the lack of recognition of Sami land rights, which results in difficulties to carry on the traditional Sami livelihoods, particularly reindeer herding. So in our article, we argue that our formal avenues and mechanisms have proven to be inadequate in finding solutions to today's big issues. They have provided us certain space. We are not saying that they're not important, but we are suggesting that in addition to our institutions and organizations, we need additional ways and tools to deliberate and find answers. So we thus propose that we need to recognize the significance and potential of our very daily off-the-Stalan practices on par with our formal mechanisms and organizations. So what we suggest is that in addition to our existing structures, we more consciously acknowledge and engage with our off-the-Stalan practices I've discussed here to find common ground and extend and advance our understanding, our shared understanding on the big issues on the table. So it's well known that current Sami affairs are widely debated. Sorry about that again. It's my super sensitive mouse. So it's well known that current Sami affairs are widely debated in coffee breaks, in the woods, in the lavvo, around the fire, and the ways of deliberation in these arenas compared to meeting rooms may differ. So we suggest that these two complement one another, and that in the formal arenas, there's a need to recognize the importance of the informal deliberations and their contributions to public and political debate. So in conclusion, off-the-Stalan practices and customs are a Sami traditional method of acquiring knowledge and advanced collective understanding. And we, the Sami ourselves, need to start seeing the value of these practices also as a means of conflict and dispute resolution among ourselves in particular, on the one hand, and on the other, contribute to the promotion of the well-being and capacity building in contemporary Sami society. So I finished there. Kiitos, Ollu. Thank you for your attention. I will stop sharing my screen now, and I think maybe we can all turn our cameras on for a few minutes, and in conclusion, if there are any questions to one another, please ask. I have actually a couple to you both, but if you have anything, please share comments or questions.
Joo, kiitos väl Rauna. Meilläkin was outan punktimis. Thank you, Rauna, for that interesting presentation. Yeah, I have a few comments or questions. Maybe first to Oula-Antti, so Rauna, you can catch your breath after your presentation. Well, I was thinking regarding what Oula-Antti, you spoke about the historic rights of Siidas, then perhaps it would be interesting to hear a few thoughts on how do you see these rights today, as I see that they are unceded rights. They have never been given away or even officially taken away, just that they have in practice ceased to guide the way that these areas are governed. So I'm thinking, especially in the context of the Girjas case from the Supreme Court of Sweden, then how do you see the unceded rights of Siidas in today's society?
Yes, thank you for your question, Áslat. And it is true, as I mentioned, that Siidas have disappeared from the official documents, but the rights of the Siidas have not disappeared, and they exist. And of course, they are partly also recognized in our current legal systems, perhaps not in Finland, but for example, in Sweden, the Reindeer Herding Act is, at least in some parts, based on the same principles and same, maybe as not as strong rights, but the ground of the rights are based on the Siidas. And as you mentioned, the Girjas court case, I think that was a good example that state tried to kind of remove rights from the Sami reindeer herding communities by an act, but the Girjas Sami village or reindeer herding community could prove that they have the immemorial right to hunting and fishing in the area, and it was also based on legal historical studies and documents from the era when the Siida rights were recognized in the Kingdom of Sweden.
Joo, kiitos. Thank you, Oula-Antti. Yeah, I think that is one very interesting example of how Sami collective rights have been recognized in recent court cases a couple of years back, the Girjas case. And yeah, Rauna, yeah, I was thinking that how much of the world's problems would be solved just by adopting this pyyntihlovi practice, like asking for permission as a standard practice. Like it is basically just basic courtesy, right? Like when you go to somewhere, you introduce yourself, you tell what are you thinking, am I welcome here, can I do this here? So it's a pretty good starting point for any activity. And yeah, it was also interesting to see how it would be good to look into how to take these concepts or practices into account more consciously in organizing different kinds of events today. Like I think many of them are part of events that we organize, but maybe it hasn't been considered so much in detail. What is the purpose of this and what is the function? But what I was thinking was this: you had many words with the same suffix, like stallan, hallan, like Fuelkas, Tallan, Järva, Hallan. We also have the Kula Hallan, which is the basic form of communication. So I was thinking if you have given this any linguistic consideration or spoken to any linguistics, because it's an interesting suffix, because as I understand it, it describes something that takes place for a while. It's not something really quick, but it takes place for a while and continuously, but not intensively necessarily. But yeah, I'm just thinking about the because there was this linguistic similarity.
Yeah, thanks for that, for bringing attention to that. It's something that we don't really consider in the article. We actually say that this is interesting, the ending, the same ending or similar ending in all of these terms, that we leave it to a linguist to consider. But actually what yours is pointing out, that there is this temporality, that it's not one-off like the Sami, the way in which Sami verbs work. There is one verb for something that happens quickly or once, and then there are verbs that in one word say that it indicates that it's a longer term process, that it takes longer. It's longer in terms of time. So it's probably something that actually we could mention, even though we don't go into linguistics, that there is this kind of temporality, like a longer time period involved in this, that it can be like kaffestalla, it can take, sometimes it's even supposed to be 5 minutes, it can become to turn into half an hour a break, or a very intense conversation or deliberation on something, and or something that starts today and then may continue next week or next month. So that's thanks for pointing that out, because our articles, they haven't been published yet, so we still have a chance to revise if we decide to do so. So thanks for that question. So if I can ask then my questions, we have a few minutes left. I really enjoyed both of the presentations, although I have read the papers, but hearing them again, it always brings new things to mind. And Áslat, I was wondering that are biologists doing much research on the ocean, or as extensively as they are doing or doing research in the Tietnu River? And the second question is kind of like more like your thoughts on why do you think that collaboration between biologists and Sami knowledge holders appears so difficult? Like this is not my area of expertise, but I was looking into something else and I came across that biologists and indigenous knowledge holders have been collaborating since the 90s. So it's not something that the Tana research group would have to invent, like it's being conducted. There is a lot of examples around the world. So why is it so difficult in Tietnu? So if I ask you first and then I go to Oula-Antti's question.
Joo, kiitos. Well, at least there is a growing emphasis on studying the situation in the ocean, but the mandate of the Tana or Tietnu fishing Tana research group, as I call them, it is in the freshwater. So that is, and that was what was my main focus in my article, to look at the studies here. But I know at least some people who are involved in the Tietnu research have been conducting studies in the ocean, and there was a recent article published in the Science journal in January this year that did conclude that overfishing of Atlantic salmon's food species has had an impact on the salmon in a way that it has decreased the size of the salmon. So there was a direct link drawn between catching of other type of fish actually to feed the farmed salmon, and by this it meant that there was not enough food for the wild salmon to feed and grow. So by feeding the salmon in the cage, you were stealing the food from the wild salmon. But Yes, at least it has been recognized in the past couple of years that there is a need to focus much more in the ocean because there are so many questions that are not known. To the second question, yeah, I mean, there is a long institutional history in this research in Dätno, and I would say, I guess it has started off in the wrong foot, and people have quite early on developed their own view of both the Sami have their own view of the biologists, and biologists have their own view of the Sami. So I think they started off on the wrong foot, so to speak. And after it was so clear that we don't believe what you say and you don't really believe what we say, so here we are. So I think that is not the most fruitful place to start building collaboration. However, I do see that there is some change happening there now, and we have at least been planning on some joint projects where we would build these methods of respectfully engaging both Sami knowledge holders and biologists in doing studies on Dätno. So I see some good advancement, or at least potential there.
Kiitos, Áslat. Very cool. Thank you, Áslat. Good to hear that at least it might be changing and moving toward a more collaborative direction. The question I had to Oula-Antti was that, what are your thoughts on reclaiming, based on your research and your work more broadly? What are your thoughts on reclaiming, like sort of like picking on what Áslat, building on what Áslat was asking, your thoughts on reclaiming Siidas and or Siida practices today? Like what are the kind of the options and possibilities and potential?
Joo, kiitos. Thank you for your question, Rauna. And well, as it has probably already been said also in our discussion, that Siida still exists, for example, in reindeer herding communities, and it has the recent reindeer herding Siida has kind of been, I think it has been the progress that we are now during this point. There have been many different kind of reasons, as I already mentioned, the nation-state borders, the changement in administration, and the reindeer herding Siida has had to kind of survive in this kind of pressure, but the current situation, especially in Finland, is so that even if we have even if the reindeer herding Siidas exist, they are not recognized in the legal system, in the acts and laws, and that is one of the reasons why Sami reindeer herding is and the customary laws of the reindeer herding communities are in a very unprotected and sensitive situation. Of course, there would be many issues that could be kind of reclaimed or revitalized, but I think one could be one concrete issue is that Samis had, or the members of the Siidas had jurisdiction power at especially in 16th and 17th century, and there were, for example, Siida members were presented in local district courts. So this could perhaps mean that maybe we could nowadays also improve the situation so that the Samis have more self-determination in this field also, but hopefully also in much more broader sense and broader fields. But this could be just one example what to take from that era, from the era of ancient Siidas when they were recognized in the state systems.
Kiitos vastaus, Oula-Antti. Lea Tuus Jereltaavat. Do you have any questions or comments to us, or do we move to wrapping this up?
Well, I think I don't have any questions at this point. It was interesting to hear your presentations.
No, tälle mun kiitän kuktui Oula-Antti ja Áslat servamistan saastallami millä tui viitat häälestän tämän siitä ieskuute peli ja tämän halttoseamis ja maita teitä kievadiin. So thank you, Áslat and Oula-Antti, for this very interesting conversation that I also enjoyed very much. We have covered the Siida history and how it has translated into some of the current day practices, how it's taken into account, and also some of the kind of like more social practices, traditional Sami social practices that I spoke about. I want to thank you for making time for this panel, for speaking today, and also again thank NAISA North and the Chinta for making space for this conversation. Ollu kiihtu ja Elle tervan.
Joo, kiitos mun puolesta. Thank you on my behalf as well.
Joo, Ollu kiihtu mun puolesta. Thank you very much on my behalf also.